Hey guys, tonight we travel along the dusty roads and crowded bazaars of the 14th century, where one young man in Morocco is about to pack his bags for the next 3 decades. You're in Tangier, where the smell of salt water wafts off the Atlantic, mixing with the sharper scent of goat hair and cumin. The walls of your family home are sunbaked and humming with flies, and your relatives are gently insisting you become a scholar of Islamic law. Of course, you smile, nod, and immediately start daydreaming about deserts, domes, and dodging all responsibilities whatsoever. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're listening in Jakarta or Jersey, drop your location and the local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe fluff your pillows, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're just 21. That awkward age where you know everything but can't be trusted with a donkey. You've got no travel experience, a vague sense of direction, and a sudden urge to complete the Hajj, Islam's sacred pilgrimage to Mecca. It's meant to be a religious rite. You treat it like a one-way ticket out of paperwork. You step through Tangier's gate with a prayer on your lips and absolutely zero clue that you'll be gone for nearly 30 years. Your only travel plan is head east, not exactly GPS. It's 13:25. You carry a modest purse, a few provisions, and the same overconfidence shared by every 20-something who's just told their parents they'll figure it out on the way. Spoiler, you absolutely will not. Almost immediately, your trip becomes complicated. You join a caravan, but the people are strangers, the food tastes like burnt almonds, and your stomach realizes the local water is not Tangier grade. You get sick, you slow everyone down. One traveler jokes that you might be carrying a demon. You consider it might just be undercooked lentils. But you persist, crossing Algeria's dusty terrain, where bandits roam and heat blurs the horizon. You see sun-baked forts, sleep under stars, and trade verses of the Quran for bowls of goat stew. Somewhere near Tunis you linger, soaking up the city's libraries, madrasas, and mint-scented courtyards. You nearly forget Mecca, but you knew then plague hits. Historians still argue whether it was bubonic or a local variation of something nastier, but it's enough to shut the ports and delay you by months. You wait it out by copying manuscripts, people-watching, and wondering if you've technically dropped out of law school now. Eventually the roads open. You continue through Tripoli and Cairo, where your senses get overwhelmed for the first time. Cairo is not a city, it's an event. Minarets stab the sky, scholars debate under the shade of date palms, and the Nile flows like some ancient lifeline from the dawn of time. You marvel. You also nearly faint from heat exhaustion. By the time you reach Mecca, the pilgrimage itself is half remembered through a fog of sunstroke and camel blisters. But you do it. You circle the Kaaba. You pray. You reflect. And then, instead of heading home like most pilgrims, you just sort of keep walking. You figure, I've come this far. Syria sounds nice. What about Persia? Maybe Yemen? And just like that, your spiritual detour becomes a life-altering odyssey. The sleepiest scholar in Morocco is now a wandering encyclopedia with a sunburn. Some say you were searching for divine knowledge. Others say you had commitment issues and an excellent tolerance for camel rides. Either way, you now believe your life isn't just about travel, it is travel. And so, you sleep under stranger stars now. You dream in dialects you don't understand, and you begin writing the mental prologue to a story so sprawling, even you won't remember half of it. You've performed the Hajj. You could stop here. You should stop here. But instead, you wander north. Because apparently, you've decided that stability is for other people. Damascus calls to you like a lullaby you've never heard before. It's cool in the evenings there, vine leaves curling over garden walls, the air thick with the scent of cardamom and rosewater. You find a teacher who quotes poetry while picking fleas off his cat. You think, yes, this is the life. But then you hear someone mention Baghdad, and your feet start itching again. You set off across Syria, toward the fabled city of scholars and caliphs. The journey is long, and the conversation gets strange. One man tells you he once saw a jinn disguised as a librarian. Another insists that onions prevent scorpion stings. You write it all down, because you never know what might end up in your travel diary. or someone else's, after they edit out the embarrassing parts. Baghdad, when you finally get there, is a shadow of its former self. The Mongols sacked it not too long ago, and while the libraries are rebuilding, there's a lingering sense of melancholic dust. You drink tea by the Tigris, watching the water reflect broken minarets, and wonder what this place must have looked like in its golden age. Historians still argue whether it had over 30 major libraries, or merely 10, but you swear you see knowledge floating in the air like incense smoke. From here, you swing south to the Arabian Gulf, stopping in Basra and then sailing down the coast. Boats creak, oarsmen sing. Dates are served with salty cheese that makes you question every life choice up to this point. But you're in it now. You arrive in the city of Hormuz, where the air is heavy with spices and trade. Persian carpets hang from balconies, and parrots scream from gilded cages. This is where you learn something essential. Wherever people get rich from trade, they also get very good at naps. Afternoon rest is a sacred art here. You blend in instantly. Next, Yemen. You hear it's green, and after months of beige landscapes, the thought of trees and misty hills makes you practically sprint there. In Sana'a, you drink coffee so strong it gives your dreams subtitles. You fall ill again, probably because you tried the fermented fish. But a local herbalist wraps your stomach in mint leaves and recites poetry while smacking you with twigs. You recover. Somehow. From there, you circle back toward Mecca for another Hajj. Your second pilgrimage is quieter. Familiar. You start to recognize the way the light hits the Kaaba at dawn, the rhythm of the crowd's prayer, the exact number of pigeons loitering near the entrance. You're no longer a visitor, you're becoming something else, a restless local in the heart of the Islamic world. And yet, you still don't go home. Word has it that Egypt is stirring again. The Mamluks are commissioning architecture so grand it makes minarets look like toothpicks. You head west, passing through Jeddah and along the Red Sea, then through the Sinai Peninsula, whose mountains glow pink at sunset and seem to whisper secrets in your sleep. When you re-enter Cairo, the city feels more familiar now, like bumping into an old friend who's taken up oil painting. You spend time in Al-Azhar, debating legal matters you barely understand anymore. A sultan's advisor asks you what kind of scholar you are. You reply that you are a scholar of travel-induced muscle cramps and overly spicy lentil stew. He laughs. You get offered a government post. You say no. Or maybe you say yes and then leave mid-shift. Historians still argue whether you ever really held a job for more than a month. It's around this point someone suggests, why not go to the Maghreb, or maybe the Black Sea? There's a prince in Anatolia who collects rare parrots. You nod, half listening. But your feet? They're already planning their next escape. You are now more than a traveller. You are a roomer with a backpack. And as you fall asleep on yet another woven mat, in yet another borrowed home, you dream not of comfort, but of maps still blank, of cities where your name will mean nothing, and that's precisely the thrill. You've crossed sands and cities, sailed coasts and dodged bureaucrats, but now things are about to escalate. You're headed west across North Africa, and let's be honest, you have no real plan, which is fine. Neither does history most of the time. First stop, Alexandria. The city is layered like baklava, Hellenistic bones, Roman ghosts, and a solid Islamic crust. You linger among marble ruins, pretending you can still hear ancient philosophers mumbling in Greek. You can't, of course. But a bookseller does swear he's got a scroll that once belonged to Aristotle. You buy it. It turns out to be a shipping invoice for lentils. Your goal now is to loop through the Maghreb, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco. Though loop is generous. It's more of a chaotic zigzag with stops determined by weather, gossip, and the occasional mild plague outbreak. At every city gate, a guard squints at you and asks what business you have. You answer with whatever suits the mood: student, judge, calligrapher, polite stranger with strong opinions about soup. Eventually, you arrive in Fez, a city with more scholars per square mile than stray cats, which is saying something. You visit madrasas, drink from brass cups at public fountains, and accidentally win a poetry competition. The prize is awkward applause and 3 sacks of almonds. By now, word of you is starting to spread. Not your name exactly, just that there's a robed man wandering through cities, collecting court jobs and quitting them shortly after. You're like a traveling wisdom podcast with sandals. Then you double back east across the desert. Because naturally, someone's told you the Sultan of Mali is fabulously wealthy and maybe hiring. You enter the Sahara. There are no roads, just sand dunes, camel bones, and heat so intense your eyebrows question their purpose. You stop at oases where the water tastes faintly of despair and overused feet. At one camp, a trader tells you the story of a man who tried to cross the Sahara, alone, with only dates and a pigeon. The pigeon made it. Finally, you reach the legendary city of Timbuktu. It's not the joke people make it out to be now. It's a scholarly hub with enormous libraries, vibrant markets, and robes so luxurious they could smother an argument. You meet clerics, astronomers, and paper merchants. You buy ink. You lose the ink. You write anyway. The Sultan of Mali, Mansa Suleiman, grants you an audience. He sits on a golden throne, guarded by spearmen with leopard skin hats. You bow. He doesn't smile. You're given gifts, lodging, and eventually some very polite suggestions that your visit might be long enough now. Historians still argue whether you were actually exiled or simply overstayed your welcome by about 15 dinners. Either way, you leave. On the way back, you pass through Gao, a city with riverboats and fish that smell like burnt hair. You catch a fever, probably from the fish, possibly from destiny, and hallucinate your way into a poet's hut. He nurses you back to health by reciting Sufi poetry while roasting sweet yams. When you finally make it back to Cairo, they barely recognize you. You're tanned, tattered, and speaking in a dialect you made up halfway through Mauritania. But you still carry yourself like a man with maps in his bones. And then, something happens. The Sultan of Delhi sends an invitation. India. India is not just far, it's unfathomably far. 1,000 cultures, hundreds of languages, and an entire subcontinent's worth of things that can go wrong. You pause, for about 3 minutes. Then you pack your bag again. Because sleep is for people who don't have to cross the Hindu Kush on foot. And you, dear listener, are now officially in over your head. You set out for India with the confidence of someone who has never been to India. The route is laughably long, tangled with mountains, hostile rulers, and more languages than even you can bluff your way through. But you're Ibn Battuta, the sleepiest explorer history's ever known, and you don't let trifles like reality stop you. Your journey cuts through Syria again, a warm-up lap if anything. Then you drift through Iraq, Persia, and down into Hormuz, where you somehow find yourself hopping aboard a junk, headed for the Sind coast. It's crowded, smelly, and full of sailors who are convinced the wind listens to gossip. You smile, you nod, you try not to vomit. Eventually, you arrive in the Delhi Sultanate, ruled by Muhammad bin Tughlaq, a man known for brilliance, cruelty, and some of the most bewildering decisions ever committed to statecraft. Think of a chess master who plays without a board and occasionally sets the pieces on fire for fun. You somehow charm your way into his court. You're offered a prestigious position as Qadi, an Islamic judge. You accept, mostly because the robes are nice and the food is hot. You settle into life in Delhi, which pulses with colour, sound, and the constant threat of being reassigned to somewhere random like Bengal or the Himalayas. The Sultan grows fond of you, or at least fond of asking your opinion on legal matters involving things like whether mango theft counts as blasphemy. You give your best answers. You quote scripture. You also fake understanding whenever someone uses complex Sanskrit terminology. Delhi itself is a sensory storm. The markets buzz with silk, saffron, and loud goats. The mosques are elaborate and echo with call to prayer. You spend your days judging disputes and your nights trying to figure out which direction home is. But stability is not your destiny. One day, the Sultan says, "I'm sending you as my ambassador to China." You blink. "Great," you say, casually trying to remember if you know anything about China. Before you can even pack, rebels rise up across the Deccan Plateau. You're given a large entourage, many horses, and vague instructions to head toward the coast. The journey is chaos. You get ambushed. Your caravan is looted. You are nearly killed by bandits who seem genuinely confused by how many shoes you own. Eventually, you limp into Calicut, modern-day Kerala, where the air is thick with sea breeze, and the people smile with that expression that says, "We've seen weirder." It's a trading port filled with Chinese, Arab and African merchants, each yelling over the price of nutmeg. You wait for a ship to China. Weeks pass. You write letters to no one. You dream of soup. The ship finally arrives. You board with relief, only for a monsoon to hurl the entire vessel into a storm so fierce, even the fish start praying. The ship is lost. You survive, barely. But your gifts for the Chinese emperor? Gone. Your documents? Gone. Your patience? Hanging by a thread. Historians still argue whether this was an accident or sabotage. Some think court rivals engineered your failure. Others think you just have awful luck. You, however, are too seasick to care. Stranded again, you wander the southern coast of India. At one point, a local ruler hires you as a diplomat. You say yes. You stay just long enough to be offered marriage to his cousin and a beach house. You politely flee. Somewhere around this point, you end up in the Maldives. Not on purpose. These islands, lush, humid, sun-drenched, should be a dream. But you're soon roped into local politics. They make you a judge again. You marry not once, not twice, but several times, mostly because it's culturally expected, and partly because you keep getting gifted wives like honorary fruit baskets. You try to enforce stricter Islamic law. The locals nod and then ignore you. You resign. You unresign. You resign again. Eventually it becomes clear that paradise is exhausting, and so you leave. Not for home, not for rest, but for Sri Lanka. Because someone mentioned a mountain where Adam first set foot after the Garden of Eden, and you simply have to see it. Of course you do. Because rest is for people without metaphysical bucket lists. And you, well, you've just had another nap on a palm leaf mat, and now you're off to climb a holy peak barefoot in the rain. You arrive in Sri Lanka drenched, bewildered, and somehow more determined than ever. The island is green beyond belief, lush forests humming with insects the size of slippers. The temples are ancient, carved from rock and nestled in mists that rise like steam from a sleepy cookpot. This is no mere stopover, this is a quest. Specifically, to climb Adam's Peak, the legendary mountaintop said to hold the footprint of the first man. Though to be fair, Buddhists believe it belongs to the Buddha. Hindus think it's Shiva's, and some locals say it's from a bird the size of a camel. You don't argue, you just climb. It's steep. The stairs are uneven. Your knees ache. Monkeys judge your progress from the trees. But at the summit, clouds peel back like curtains, and the whole island yawns beneath you, green, gold, and gently steaming. You press your forehead to the stone, unsure what to believe, but certain this was worth the blisters. You descend and promptly catch another fever. Sri Lanka seems to greet guests with beauty and mild organ failure. A healer gives you a broth made from boiled mango leaves. You throw up, then fall asleep for 2 days. When you wake, someone's goat is sleeping on your foot. Clearly it's time to leave. You sail east, hopping along the Indian coastline again, because staying still is not in your vocabulary. In the port of Chittagong, you hear talk of great ships sailing to the Far East. Places with names like Zehun and Khanbalik. That's China in case you're running low on historical atlases. And you? You decide this is the time to try again. A Chinese junk, massive, multi-decked, and reeking of lacquer and dried fish, takes you on. The crew are efficient, the wind is kind, and for once, nothing catches fire or sinks in the first week. You sail through the Straits of Malacca, where the jungle leans in from both sides like it's trying to eavesdrop. Merchants in floating markets sell pepper, pearls, and monkeys in tiny hats. You politely decline the monkeys. At sea, everything slows. The sky blurs into ocean. You write in your journal, nap in awkward positions, and occasionally panic over whether you've become a permanent passenger on the world's weirdest cruise. Finally, miraculously, you arrive in China. Southern China, to be precise. The city of Quanzhou rises ahead of you, with curved rooftops and incense-thick air. The locals stare at your robes. You stare at their porcelain. Everyone pretends to understand each other through translators who mostly guess. You are escorted inland, under imperial supervision. China is orderly. Too orderly. Inns are spotless. Bureaucrats wear colour-coded hats. One official fines you for over-tipping a monk. Another invites you to dinner, where you sit for 6 hours and never find the rice. You want to meet the emperor. That's been your goal, after all. But between scheduling delays, gift requirements, and a general sense that foreigners are more amusing than important, it never quite happens. Historians still argue whether you got as far as Beijing, or if your account borrowed from other travellers. You do describe roads so wide, 10 horsemen could ride abreast, and canals filled with boats stacked like bookshelves. But scholars raise eyebrows. You, however, raise your teacup and keep telling your story. Eventually, your hosts gently but firmly encourage your departure. You get the sense that your cultural observations are being matched by their cultural exhaustion, and so you turn back once again. The return trip is less majestic. Pirates attack. You lose money, possessions, and for a few days your sense of direction. You drift through Indonesia, possibly Malaysia, almost certainly Sumatra. You meet a man who claims to be descended from a dragon. You don't question it. You've seen stranger things. By the time you reach Calicut again, your beard has greyed, and your journal is so full, it's held together with string and spilled dates. You stare at the ocean and wonder, should I go home? But first, maybe one more stop. After all, the Maldives are just over there. And you might have left a pair of sandals behind. By now, the idea of home feels more like a concept than a destination. You've wandered for over a decade, been judge, diplomat, near-drowning victim, and honorary cousin to more royal families than you can name. But you've also lost track of time. You blink, and it's been 15 years since you last saw Tangier. Still, one last side quest won't hurt, right? So you veer west again, landing first in Bengal. The humidity hits like a wet blanket soaked in chili oil. The streets overflow with betel-stained smiles and carts groaning with jackfruit. You try to blend in, but your accent is now a fusion of at least 7 regions and possibly mild trauma. In Sonargaon, a local court takes interest in you. They appoint you to a diplomatic mission heading further east. You nod, smiling. You have no idea where you're going. Soon you find yourself back aboard yet another ship, cutting south into the Bay of Bengal. The days are long and quiet, except when a crew member breaks into spontaneous weeping due to bad coconuts. You learn the subtle art of staying out of other people's spiritual crises. You land in Sumatra, green, volcanic, and covered in forests that hum like 1,000 mosquito choirs. The king of Samudra is a Muslim and greets you with incense and roasted bananas. You perform diplomatic pleasantries. You hand over letters of goodwill. You also accidentally insult someone's grandmother by mispronouncing a ceremonial blessing. It's fine. You've been nearly exiled for less. Your route takes you through the spice ports of the Malay Peninsula, where nutmeg is worth more than gold and cinnamon comes with political consequences. Traders gather like birds in a banyan tree. You, the ever-wandering judge turned ambassador, now feel more like a piece of trade yourself. Carried from hand to hand, from court to court. Somewhere in the Sulu Sea, your ship nearly collides with a sea monster, or a very confused manatee. You're too tired to care. You wrap your journal in oilskin, say a prayer, and try to sleep through the storm. Eventually, you make it back to India. Not triumphantly, but with that deeply exhausted shuffle of someone who's seen too much, eaten too many sour plums, and once shared a bed with a goat. Again. You stay briefly in Calicut. You consider settling down. The air smells familiar. The The food is warm. Someone even offers you a teaching post. But then you hear that the Black Death has reached the Middle East, and for some reason that is what finally turns you west. You pass back through Hormuz, Arabia and Mecca. Pilgrims are fewer now. The caravan trails are littered with stories of vanished villages and silent wells. You meet survivors who speak in hushed tones, clutching amulets and old songs. Historians still argue whether the plague killed 1/3 or more of the population, but the silence speaks volumes. Finally, you reach Damascus. The city is beautiful in its sadness. People avoid touching door frames, markets are thin, you hear of friends lost, mentors gone. And one night, as the azan floats over the rooftops, you realize you are no longer a young man with a long journey ahead. You are a man with a long journey behind. You return to Cairo, and from there, north to Alexandria. The sea smells like goodbye. It takes time, but eventually you make it back to Tangier. The streets are smaller than you remember, the doors have changed colour. Neighbours glance twice, a cousin stares before recognising you. They tell you your mother passed just months before. You missed her by a heartbeat. You unpack in silence. The walls of your old room look unchanged, but the air feels thin with absence. You've wandered more than anyone you've ever met. You've seen sultans snap their fingers and kingdoms crumble between breakfast and lunch. You've eaten fish in the Maldives, prayed in China, climbed Sri Lanka's peaks, and worn silk robes you still don't know how to fold properly. And now, you sit in your childhood home, wondering what comes next. You sleep. Not because the journey is over, but because even the greatest explorers sometimes need a pause. Back in Tangier, you pace the same streets you once left behind in a flurry of ambition and itchy feet, but now, they feel smaller. The walls of the Medina are tighter. The call to prayer echoes with memories you no longer share. And you? You're a relic from the outside world, sun-worn, story-stuffed and slightly suspicious to everyone who still remembers you as the kid who couldn't finish law school. You try to settle. You really do. You teach, briefly. You help with disputes at the local mosque. You even grow herbs in a clay pot by the window. But your dreams still drift elsewhere. To forests in Sumatra, alleyways in Damascus. The sound of camel bells beyond Timbuktu. Then one day, a royal messenger arrives. The Sultan of Morocco wants to meet you. You're summoned to Fez, where the royal court is glittering with ambition and the scent of rosewater is thick enough to make you sneeze. The Sultan, Abu Inan, is a man who likes books, prestige, and hearing about places he'll never visit. You are, essentially, a walking Netflix subscription. He asks about your travels. You answer with tales of Mamluks and Mongols, of cities where women ran banks and couriers travelled by pigeon. You describe Chinese customs officers with jade seal stamps, and Indian judges who used parrots as witnesses. The Sultan laughs, claps, and immediately assigns you a ghostwriter. Enter Ibn Juzai, a bright-eyed scholar with a patient demeanour and excellent penmanship. His job? To take your chaotic, meandering, occasionally suspicious stories and mould them into a manuscript fit for royal archives. He sits across from you in a tiled courtyard, scroll in hand, nodding politely, as you recall events out of order, change names mid-sentence, and get distracted by pigeons. The writing begins, and with it, the strange sensation of watching your life become legend. You describe distant cities, Samarkand's blue domes, Mali's golden courtyards, China's porcelain towers. You recall faces, some clear, some smudged by time. You remember how sweet the dates were in Damascus after a fast, how bitter the sea tasted during storms off Java, how quiet the world seemed when you stood atop Adam's Peak and looked down on the mist. Ibn Juzay sometimes pauses. Did this really happen? You shrug, something like it. Historians still argue over the accuracy of your account. Did you truly make it to Beijing? Was that royal encounter in Mali as lavish as described? Did the Maldives really crown you judge and pay you in coconuts? The truth, as always, is a little sleepier than fiction. But the rihla, your travelogue, takes shape. It becomes a tapestry of places stitched together by memory, hearsay, and the occasional dream. You don't just describe geography, you capture rhythms. How morning prayers sounded in Anatolia, how ships creaked off Calicut, how silence settled over Baghdad's ruins. You give advice to travelers, some practical, never trust a boat without a name, some bizarre, avoid fried eels near Cairo, and some profoundly poetic. And just like that, your wandering begins to fossilize into something lasting. You remain in Fez as the manuscript is copied and shared. Scholars debate its contents. Some call you an exaggerator, others call you a genius. A few just call you the guy who really hated boats. But no one ignores you. You're no longer just a traveller. You're a witness to the 14th century world, a man who lived more lives than his own. And still, when the wind blows in from the east, smelling faintly of spices and far-off rain, your fingers twitch. You imagine the edge of a new map curling up somewhere waiting. But now, you let others walk it. For the first time in years, you rest, not because the road is gone, but because someone else might be waiting to hear your footsteps. The days in Fez become a slow swirl of repetition. Morning prayer, mint tea, small strolls through shaded alleys where children chase cats and old men pretend not to nap. You're older now. Your knees complain more often. The calluses on your feet have faded, but the urge to move never truly goes away. It just simmers under the surface, like tea left too long on the coals. You think often of the people you met. Some you remember clearly, the scholar in Damascus who laughed with his eyes, the Maldivian woman who taught you how to string jasmine, the sailor in Calicut who swore he once saw a moon fall into the ocean. Others are softer in your memory, a voice here, a laugh there, the feel of a silk robe passed to you in a crowded market. It all begins to blur, like the horizon after weeks at sea. One afternoon, you receive word from a small caravan heading toward Granada. You join for a few weeks just to stretch your legs. The landscapes are familiar but changed. Spain is restless, caught between faiths, languages, and kings who speak of glory but only build more walls. You sit by a fire with Berber traders. One of them asks if you've truly been to the edge of the world. You pause. "I've been to the edge of many things," you reply. He nods, then hands you a fig. When you return to Fez, it feels quieter than before. Ibn Juzay has completed the manuscript, copies are being made. You attend a small gathering where scholars recite your words, quoting your experiences as though they belong to someone else. You sit in the back, chewing honeyed almonds, wondering if they'll skip the part about the pirates. They don't. Your name begins to echo in distant places. Cairo scholars annotate your route. Persian poets insert you into verses. Even in far-off Samarkand, someone writes a poem about the Moroccan who kept walking. But at home, your real home, there's a strangeness now. Tangier welcomes you, but you no longer belong fully to its rhythm. The streets feel narrower, the ocean quieter, the sky somehow lower. You visit your old house. It's been repainted. Someone else's child now plays in the courtyard where you once dreamed of leaving. So you leave again, though not far. You travel in circles now. Between Fez, Marrakesh, the coastal towns, people recognize your name but not your face. That suits you fine. You've become a myth wrapped in sandals. Some days, you sit beneath a fig tree and scribble notes. Additions to the reeler, dreams you forgot to mention. Arguments you'd like to have with your ghostwriter. Other days, you simply nap, letting the breeze rustle through the leaves and pretend it's the distant wind off the Red Sea. Historians still argue whether you fully understood the scope of your journey. Did you know your writings would survive? That future readers would trace your steps with fingers on dusty maps? That children in lands you never named would memorize your paths as bedtime stories? Perhaps not, but you did understand something. That the world is too big to sleep through and too beautiful to rush. And yet, here you are now, resting, not defeated, not finished, just still. It's a strange peace, this kind of motionless travelling. You look at the stars some nights and remember what they looked like from a Malian desert, a Chinese port, a Sri Lankan peak. They are the same stars, but you are not the same man. You've aged, slowed, softened, but inside, you are still walking, always walking, even now. Time keeps folding itself around you, like a blanket pulled snug across a drowsy traveller. You no longer count the years, it's too slippery, too silly. What's a year, after all, to someone who once crossed half the world because a merchant mentioned a mountain? You live now in the background of the royal court in Fez. Not exactly forgotten, but no longer centre stage. You stroll slowly through courtyards, your walking stick clicking on stone tiles as birds chatter above you like nosy scribes. Some days a young scholar joins you, asking earnest questions about Samarkand or Zanzibar, or whether Sri Lankan coconuts are really better. You pause before answering, not out of age, but because some memories taste better when savoured slowly. You tell him stories that slip between truth and dream. Of city gates carved like lace, of jungle paths where leopards blinked from shadows, of Chinese gardens where the air smelled like snow. You forget names, you exaggerate details, but the laughter still comes easy. "Did you ever get lost?" he asks once. You chuckle. "Constantly. That's how you find the best bread." Your stories begin taking on lives of their own. In the alleys of Fez, kids reenact your great river crossing using chickens and upturned baskets. A baker names a flatbread after your favourite travel snack, which may or may not have been invented mid-sentence. In one madrasa, someone swears you once debated a djinn disguised as a spice merchant. You let the tale go uncorrected. Meanwhile, copies of your rihla make their way across the known world. They travel faster than you ever could, carried by scholars, hidden in saddlebags, tucked between trade goods and old poems. People who've never seen the sea now dream of ships because of your words. But the irony is not lost on you. The man who spent a lifetime in motion is now remembered not for where he went, but how he told it. Still, you sometimes think back to the moments between the headlines. The night you sat alone in a Turkish orchard, listening to frogs. The time a Sufi mystic in Shiraz offered you tea and forgot your name mid-sentence. The worn sandals you gave to a boy in Delhi who laughed like falling coins. Historians still argue over whether your accounts are literal, embellished, or simply stitched together from collective memory. But they miss the point entirely. You weren't writing a map. You were writing a mood, a feeling. That drowsy wonder when the world feels bigger than your problems. That quiet amazement when strangers become friends over dried figs. That sleepy stretch of limbs on a rooftop, watching stars wobble across the desert sky. Now, each evening, you sit beneath a fig tree just outside Fez. The sun sets slowly, like it knows you're watching. You sometimes speak to it as if it's an old caravan leader. "Tell the clouds to wait," you murmur. "I'm almost finished remembering." Your journal lies open beside you. You don't write in it anymore. Not because the stories have run out, but because the silence is telling them better now. One morning, you don't wake up. The fig leaves rustle gently. A sparrow hops across your sandals. The ink in your old pen has dried, but your footsteps remain. Not just in sand or stone, but in stories. Soft, sleepy stories that stretch across centuries. And somewhere, in a quiet room lit only by candlelight, someone opens your rilla and starts to read. And you begin walking again. The world has moved on, but your story has not. In libraries, your name is now inked into catalogues. In scrolls and books, across lands you once traced with your own tired feet, your words hum with the slow rhythm of travel, not the urgent gallop of conquest, nor the hurried scrawl of kings, but the lazy meander of a man who asked one too many questions at every crossroads. You are, in a way, still in motion. Somewhere in Andalusia, a scholar debates the accuracy of your account of Mongol customs. In Cairo, a child dozes off hearing your story for the third time. In Istanbul, a merchant recites your tale to spice traders who swear your footsteps bless the roads they walk now. And in Tangier, where it all began, there's a small corner of a cemetery where your name is carved in stone. a modest plaque often kissed by sun and silence, visited more by wind than people. But every so often someone stops there. They squint at the name, and then they smile, because the man buried there once wandered the known world and a little beyond. You never wrote with the certainty of a conqueror. You weren't interested in borders or politics, not really. You were interested in the feel of places, in how prayers echoed off domes in Delhi, in the way Chinese ink bled slowly across rice paper, in how camels grumbled like tired philosophers, and Maldivian bread smelled like ocean salt and cinnamon. Your legacy is not empire or monument, it's memory, worn smooth with retelling, carried quietly in bedtime stories, whispered over cups of tea, scrawled in the margins of schoolbooks and footnotes, sometimes mocked, sometimes doubted, always remembered. And the road you walked, it never really ended. It simply turned into pages. So now, listener, let's leave the map behind. Close your eyes, if you haven't already, and let the last images of this journey settle. Not with urgency, but with ease. Feel the hush of a desert night stretching wide across sand you'll never cross. Imagine the wooden creak of a ship swaying gently on an unfamiliar sea, the scent of cardamom and dust clinging to your sleeves after a long walk through a crowded market in a city you've already forgotten the name of. You can hear it now, can't you? The soft breath of camels resting, the far-off murmur of a call to prayer, the rustle of old pages turned by candlelight, all the little details Ibn Battuta once noticed, because he knew that how you remember the world is just as important as where you've been. Let your breath slow now. Let your thoughts stretch and scatter like footsteps on a wind-blown path. And if, as you drift, you feel the faint urge to wander, to sail off towards stars or fall asleep under imaginary palms, well, you wouldn't be the first, and you certainly won't be the last, because the world is wide and the night is long, and somewhere out there, the next story is already unfolding. Just not tonight. Tonight we rest. Let the speech at Gettysburg linger in the background like the toll of a distant bell. It wasn't just a speech, it was a promise. Not only to the country, but perhaps, unknowingly, to himself. A vow that the struggle was not in vain. That all he had endured to get to that hillside of words meant something. Historians still argue whether Lincoln fully knew the power of that moment. Some say he scribbled it almost as an afterthought, on the back of an envelope during the train ride. Others insist he had been drafting it for days, whispering phrases to himself between meetings, hearing the music of the words in his head before ever putting pen to paper. And here's a quiet quirk. He wasn't even the main speaker that day. Edward Everett, a former Secretary of State and orator, spoke for over 2 hours. Lincoln? Just 272 words. Me. But those were the words the world remembered. He left the stage, thinking it had been a failure. That speech won't scour, he told a friend afterward, using a farming metaphor from his youth. But it did. Oh, it did. The speech travelled farther than he ever would. It was a moment where time paused, where a weary, war-torn nation listened, and for just a moment, believed again. And so tonight, as we float backward into the mists of Lincoln's life, we begin not with a cradle, but with the summit. From here, we slowly step back, through torn maps and muddy boots, through childhood nights thick with fireflies and solitude, through heartbreaks, failures, love, letters, trials, and slow redemption, through silence and towards something better. Because sometimes, history doesn't thunder in, it whispers. And tonight, that whisper is Abraham Lincoln's. It was a grey morning in February of 1809 when the first breath of Abraham Lincoln stirred the cold air inside a one-room log cabin in the wilds of Hardin County, Kentucky. The world outside was still half frozen. Chickens rustled in the straw. Smoke curled from a nearby chimney, barely rising before the wind took it. Inside the cabin, just 16 feet by 18, life began for the boy who would one day carry a country on his shoulders. He was born on a bed of wooden slats and corn husks, wrapped in rough cloth, into a family that owned almost nothing. No fancy silverware, no books, not even proper shoes. Just a dirt floor, walls of split logs, and a single window smaller than most of today's computer screens. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a carpenter and farmer, hard-working, thick with muscle and quiet judgment. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was softer, gentler in her manner, with dark hair and sad eyes. There's a timeless sorrow in the way people talk about her, as if she knew deep down that her time with Abraham would be brief. They named the boy Abraham after his grandfather, who had died in a skirmish with Native Americans years earlier. That old Abraham had also tried to carve a life from the Kentucky woods, and so in a way, the child carried more than a name. He carried hope, and perhaps a bit of a curse too. From the beginning, Abraham was tall for his age, quiet, thoughtful, not shy exactly, but often found sitting alone, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick while other children played tag or climbed trees. He preferred to listen. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was careful, deliberate. He watched the sky a lot. He loved animals, especially the ones that others ignored. There's a story about him rescuing a bird that had fallen from its nest. He climbed the tree barefoot, scratched and bruised his legs, but gently placed it back. That may seem like a small act, but some say that one moment, a child helping a creature most would leave behind, says everything about the man he'd become. And yet, for all the sweetness, life was not kind. The Lincolns moved often. Land disputes were common. Thomas lost one property after another to unclear deeds and dishonest claims, so the family packed their sparse belongings and started over again, and again, and again. In these early years, Abraham learned about uncertainty the way most kids learn to count. By the time he was 7, they moved from Kentucky to Indiana, a journey across rivers, forests, and mud-soaked paths. They crossed the Ohio River with their livestock in tow and began hacking a clearing out of the thick woods. Trees fell, logs became walls. That winter was brutal. The cabin had no fireplace at first. They burned green wood. The air inside stayed damp and smoky. But Abraham learned to chop wood with a rhythm that would stay with him forever. His hands grew calloused early. The rail splitter, they would one day call him. It started here. He didn't go to school much. In fact, over the course of his entire boyhood, his formal education added up to less than a single year. But he read everything he could find when he could find it. The Bible, Pilgrim's Progress, Robinson Crusoe, and old law books. If he didn't have paper, he used a shovel, a wall, a pane of frost on a window. His mind was always hungry. And there's a tiny, strange fact not many mention. Little Abe had a surprisingly high-pitched voice. Not the deep tone we imagine from statues and movies. When he laughed, which he did often despite the hard life, it came out like a giggle. It startled people. Historians still debate what this means for how he was perceived. Was it charming, distracting, or maybe part of what made him memorable? And yet, despite these quirks, or perhaps because of them, people liked him. He didn't bully. He didn't brag. He helped his mother churn butter. He fixed fences. He carried buckets of water from the creek day after day. And somewhere in those early years, in the low hum of chores, in the hush of candlelight, something deeper began to stir. He would talk to himself when alone, practice speaking aloud, try on words like clothes, not just reading, but performing. No one noticed it at first, but the seeds were there. The cabin is long gone now. The trees around it have changed. But somewhere, deep in the soil of Kentucky and Indiana, the echoes of those first footsteps still linger. The frost on the window, the creak of a wooden bucket handle, the whisper of pages turning in the night. They all belong to the boy with wide eyes and an old soul, and he is just beginning. If you walk through a clearing in southern Indiana today, just as the light begins to spill like honey through the trees, you might hear it, the whisper of something old. Not words, exactly, more like a presence, a memory clinging to the bark and breeze. Here, in the early 1820s, a tall boy with too short trousers and an ever-curious stare wandered through the woods with a book in one hand and an axe in the other. He was barely 10 when he first began reading in earnest, not because someone told him to, but because it was a way out of poverty, out of obscurity, out of silence. In those days, books were rare in the backwoods, sometimes just one or two in an entire home. But young Abraham Lincoln devoured whatever he could find, borrowed, bartered, copied. He would walk for miles, sometimes as far as 10 miles each way, just to get his hands on a book. Neighbors remember seeing him stride barefoot along frozen paths, holding a volume of Aesop's fables or the King James Bible like it was a loaf of bread. Once, after reading Parson Weems's Life of Washington, he recited the entire thing aloud to his family by firelight. Not just the facts, he mimicked the voices, the flair, the rhythm. They say he made even the wooden spoon in his hand seem like a sword. Now here's a little-known detail. When Abraham couldn't find paper, he would take a piece of bark or a wooden plank, blacken the end of a stick in the fire, and write his notes in ash. His stepmother, Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln, once said, "He didn't write like a boy. He wrote like he was carving something important. In a way, he was." And there's another story, perhaps half true, perhaps completely, that he once borrowed a book from a farmer, but it got soaked during a rainstorm when he had no shelf and the roof leaked. To repay the damage, he worked for the man for 3 days straight, husking corn and chopping wood, just to make things right. Historians still debate whether this tale is real or polished in the telling. But whether factual or fable, it shows something deeper, how seriously he took his word. He once said, "When I do good, I feel good. When I do bad, I feel bad. That's my religion." Simple, like his writing, like his life. In those Indiana winters, nights came early and stayed long. There was no electricity, no lamps unless you made candles yourself. So Abraham often read by firelight, squinting through smoke, his elbows resting on a plank balanced across his knees. The rhythm of his days was always the same: work, chop, haul, read, think, then repeat. It wasn't glamorous, but it was profound. That constant movement of muscles and mind, that's what shaped him. Even as a teenager, he was unusually strong. He could drive an axe deeper and faster than men twice his age. He once wrestled the town champion and won, not with brute force, but clever footwork and patience, a fact that earned him quiet respect, and a spot in the National Wrestling Hall of Fame much, much later. And yet, he never bragged. In fact, when praised, he'd often just shrug and walk away. But sometimes, when no one was watching, he'd stand on a stump in the woods, pretend he was in front of a great crowd, and deliver a speech to the squirrels and owls. Somewhere between the timber and the torn books, a speaker was forming. A man who could wrap logic and empathy into the same sentence. A storyteller, a philosopher in boots too big for his feet. There was one more ingredient in all this, something unspoken, a sadness. Maybe it came from losing his mother so early, or from watching the people around him grind through life with no hope of more. But instead of letting it turn bitter, he turned it inward. Let it make him kind. Years later, when asked where he got his ideas, Lincoln simply said, "I am nothing." But truth is everything. It wasn't modesty, it was memory. He remembered being the boy too poor for parchment, the boy who wrote essays in charcoal, the boy who read Shakespeare beside a fire built from damp twigs. Not because he had to, but because he needed to. And even now, when you think of great minds, you probably imagine velvet chairs, university walls, rows of leather books. But for Abraham Lincoln, it was a split-log bench, the creak of old wood, the rustle of a dog-eared page, the soft flicker of firelight painting the ceiling with stories. And somewhere deep in the folds of time, that boy is still sitting there, reading, becoming. The wind in Indiana never asked questions. It simply arrived each winter with a bitter certainty, slipping through the gaps in the logs and curling around every sleeping figure like a second skin. In those winters of the 1820s, Abraham Lincoln was still just a boy, but already taller than most men around him, with limbs that seemed borrowed from a much older frame. It was around this time, in 1818, when the first crack formed in the world he had begun to understand. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, grew ill, slowly at first, then quickly, like a candle being blown out from the inside. Milk sickness, they called it, a mysterious and unforgiving ailment spread by tainted milk from cows grazing on a certain wild plant. Abraham was only 9. He remembered her eyes most of all, how they seemed to be looking somewhere past him, even when he stood right in front of her. On the final morning, she asked him to be good, to look after his sister Sarah, and to remember his books. Then she was gone. They buried her on a knoll near the cabin, under a handmade wooden cross. No priest, no ceremony, just dirt, silence, and a child's eyes trying to understand the finality of nothing. For months afterward, Abraham barely spoke. He would go into the woods and sit beside a stream, listening to the sound of water on stone. At night, when the fire died low, he'd stare into the embers, lips moving with invisible prayers. But life, in its strange rhythm, has a way of planting comfort where you least expect it. His father, Thomas, left the children alone with relatives and returned weeks later with a new woman, Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln, and she was kind. She brought furniture, books, stories, and warmth. She saw Abraham not as a gangly burden, but as something rare. She encouraged his reading, gave him extra blankets, and called him her own. She made me feel like I mattered, he would say later, and it changed him. With her encouragement, he began to grow, not just in height, but in thought. He helped raise barns, dug wells, carried stones. He learned to work with ploughs, yokes, and shovels, all while reciting lines of poetry under his breath. There's a memory he once shared of standing in the middle of a frozen cornfield, balancing a book atop a fence post while splitting logs. He'd read a sentence, swing the axe, read another, swing again. Simple rhythm, but underneath it, transformation. And yet, even with his new stepmother's care, Abraham remained a quiet child. Neighbours would often describe him walking alone along the edges of fields, lips moving slightly, lost in thought. He loved humour, told stories at dinner, made clever little rhymes about neighbours, never cruel, just mischievous. He would sketch animals in the dirt with a stick. Once, he tried to write a full poem about a frog that jumped across a frozen pond and cracked the ice with a sound that startled the stars. Even now, historians debate whether he truly wrote it, or if the tale was embroidered over time. But either way, the boy who once only listened was beginning to speak. Another odd detail. Abraham disliked hunting. While nearly every other boy in Indiana carried a musket, he refused to shoot animals unless it was absolutely necessary. He once scolded a friend for tying firecrackers to a turtle's shell. "That creature's never done you harm," he whispered, turning away. He also began to understand human conflict in quiet ways. At age 16, he mediated a dispute between two farmers over a broken fence. With no training, no title, and no script, he listened, paused, then offered a solution that left both men nodding. His sister, Sarah, joked that Abraham was more preacher than ploughman. But it was the long winters, the endless hush between December and March, that did the real shaping. In the firelight, while snow clung to the windows, Abraham studied. He copied down speeches, practiced cursive, listened to the sound of his own voice bouncing off the log walls. He read aloud to anyone who would listen, sometimes even to the mule. Sarah Bush Johnston once peeked into the barn and saw him standing on a barrel, reciting Patrick Henry's "Give me liberty" or "Give me death" speech to a flock of chickens. They scattered, but the boy stayed, eyes closed, rehearsing. The winters came and went. His voice deepened, his shoulders broadened. He grew into his frame and into something more, a quiet knowing that life would always be difficult, but it could still be meaningful. That words, when chosen with care, could build bridges stronger than timber. And that grief never truly leaves. It simply folds itself into the corners of your story, like snow drifted against the door. By the time he turned 17, Abraham Lincoln stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, towering above his peers, both in frame and in spirit. But in his heart, he was still the boy from the frozen cabin, watching the world, pencil in hand, wondering what he could make of it. It was the spring of 1828, and the river called to him. By now, Abraham Lincoln was 19, tall, wiry, and strangely graceful for someone shaped by axe handles and heavy lifting. The farm had become too small for his growing mind. He needed to see more, feel more, understand the country beyond the horizon. So when the chance came to float goods down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, he took it. He and a partner built a flatboat, essentially a wooden box with a rudder, and loaded it with barrels of corn, pork, and other goods to trade. Then they pushed off into the wide, muddy current and let the river do the pulling. The trip changed him. The Mississippi was no quiet forest stream. It rolled and surged with a strange, living energy, sometimes lazy, sometimes angry, always full of stories. They slept under the stars, tied the boat to trees at night, and traded jokes with strangers in passing towns. Abraham made notes in his head about people's accents, the food, the songs they hummed. But somewhere near the southern tip of the journey, in Louisiana, came the moment that would settle deep into his soul. New Orleans. It was a bustling, chaotic city, bright with colors, full of music and languages from every corner of the globe. But it was also the first place Abraham saw slavery in its most brutal form. Men and women in chains, families pulled apart on auction blocks, the loud voices of buyers, the silence of the sold. He didn't say much that day, but he watched. His face changed, according to a companion. Years later, he would write, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." Historians still argue whether that moment in New Orleans was the seed of his abolitionist stance, or merely one more brick in a wall he had already begun building. But the shadow of it never left him. Even now, if you walk the old docks of the city, it's said the ghosts of history still linger in the humidity. That trip had other stories too. A skirmish with river pirates who tried to steal from the flatboat. Abraham, using nothing but an oar and a flash of courage, fought them off. He returned home not just older, but altered. When he stepped back into Indiana soil, he wasn't just Thomas Lincoln's son anymore. He was Abraham, a man beginning to see himself as something more than a farmhand, and as luck, or fate, would have it, the family soon moved again, this time to Illinois. It was 1830 when they packed up their tools and livestock and made the journey westward, crossing the flat, endless plains. The land was wide, sky broader than he had ever seen. They settled in Macon County, and once again, Abraham helped chop logs, raise cabins, and dig wells. But something in him resisted the soil now. He had seen what lay beyond, and he couldn't unsee it. So when the spring thaw arrived, and a small trading post in a town called New Salem needed help, Abraham set off, this time without his family. He was barely 21, no money, no plan, just a hunger. New Salem was small, nestled on the Sangamon River, dotted with clapboard buildings and muddy streets, and it was here that he began to build his legend, piece by unlikely piece. He took odd jobs, splitting rails, clerking in a store, surveying land, and even serving briefly as the village postmaster. He read every spare moment, carried books in his pockets, practiced law by reading commentaries and watching court cases like they were stage plays. And there was something else. To drunk men rambling at the tavern, to farmers complaining about taxes, to mothers worrying over winter stores. Abraham listened with the kind of patience that made people feel seen. And when he spoke, rarely, it had weight. But New Salem also gave him something unexpected, a taste of his own voice. Once, during a local gathering, a crowd of townsfolk began to argue over a boundary dispute. Someone asked Abe to weigh in. He stood, reluctantly, and began to speak, softly at first, then with confidence. His words were plain, honest, and sprinkled with just enough humor to disarm the tension. The dispute ended with laughter, handshakes, and a man offering him a slice of pie as thanks. The village took notice. "Maybe you ought to run for office," one old man chuckled. Lincoln just smiled. But deep down, he had already begun to wonder what it would be like to speak not just for New Salem, but for something bigger. Here's a curious detail. Around this time, Abraham tried writing poetry, and not just once or twice. He wrote dozens of verses. Most were never published, but in one he reflected on death, the passing of youth, and the weight of memory. For a man surrounded by law books and ledgers, he still made space for the tender things. Historians still debate whether he ever really wanted to be a politician, or whether he simply couldn't bear to see problems go unspoken. But either way, he was beginning to rise. By the early 1830s, the little town of New Salem had settled into Abraham Lincoln like a coat that didn't quite fit, but kept him warm nonetheless. He was now in his early 20s, a strange blend of awkward and impressive. Towering over most men at 6 feet 4 inches, he still wore shirts that hung loose around his skinny frame. His hair, black, unruly, refused to behave, and his trousers were often too short. But there was something magnetic about him, even if no one could quite explain why. He wasn't handsome, not in the classical sense, but his eyes were honest, his handshake firm. And when he told a story, whether it was about a runaway pig or a courtroom drama he'd read about, people leaned in. He still took odd jobs, ran a general store for a while. It failed, borrowed money to keep it afloat, and when it closed, he was left with debt that took him years to repay. He jokingly referred to it as the national debt, but he paid every cent. That was the thing about Lincoln. Even when the world gave him an exit, he took the long way, quietly, honestly. He became known as someone who couldn't lie convincingly even if he tried. Once, during a court case years later, he realized midway through an argument that he was wrong and immediately switched sides. His client was furious, but Lincoln's conscience wouldn't allow him to continue on false footing. He also tried his hand at military service, briefly. When a local militia formed to fight in the Black Hawk War in 1832, Lincoln was elected captain. Not because he knew how to lead men, but because the townsfolk trusted his judgment. They later joked that the only thing he ever killed during the campaign was time. Still, the experience shaped him. It taught him to listen to fear, to boredom, to the eerie quiet of a camp before dawn. He never saw real combat, but he saw real people. That was enough. When he returned to New Salem, he began reading law. No university, no professor. Just books borrowed, pages copied, paragraphs memorized while sitting on split logs or pacing between chores. Historians still marvel at how he did it. But it was simple, really. He read, he thought, he asked questions. And when he didn't understand something, he asked again. Then, in 1834, came the pivot. Lincoln ran for the Illinois state legislature and won. He was 25. His campaign was humble. No grand promises, no polished speeches, just honesty, handshakes, and stories. He walked miles to talk to farmers, helped fix fences on the way, wrote letters to people he couldn't visit, and people responded, not with loud applause, but with quiet trust. He served 4 terms in the state legislature and quickly gained a reputation for logic, clarity, and fairness. He rarely raised his voice, but when he spoke, he had a way of making both sides feel heard. One quirky little moment from these years. Lincoln once defended a friend in court who had been accused of assault. His entire defense was just a few sentences long and ended with, "I leave the matter to your judgment, gentlemen, but if I had been there, I'd probably have done the same thing." The jury burst out laughing. The friend was acquitted. That's the thing. Lincoln didn't always argue. Sometimes, he simply made people see. He moved to Springfield in 1837. It was a busier town with dirt roads, wooden sidewalks, and a buzzing little community of lawyers, clerks, and dreamers. He hung his shingle as a country attorney and took on all kinds of cases: property disputes, debt collection, even the occasional criminal defense. He once defended 2 brothers accused of murder, discovering that the key witness had lied about seeing the crime during a full moon. Lincoln proved there hadn't been a full moon at all, and the brothers were freed. He built a law partnership with William Herndon, a man younger than him, sharp but more academic. The two were mismatched in some ways. Herndon liked legal theory, Lincoln preferred common sense, but their partnership worked. Lincoln became known not just for winning cases, but for helping opposing counsel save face. He'd win the argument, then find a way to offer the other side a dignified exit. Historians still debate whether he ever fully enjoyed law or merely saw it as a stepping stone. but it sharpened his mind, polished his voice, gave him tools. And in the evenings, after the courtrooms emptied and the oil lamps flickered in their final glow, he would walk the dirt roads of Springfield alone, thinking, remembering, smiling quietly to himself at something someone had said. He never stopped telling stories. In fact, his ability to weave humor and honesty into tales became a tool in both court and conversation. Once, when accused of being two-faced, he replied, "If I had another face, do you think I'd be wearing this one?" Even his rivals laughed. He was rising, not quickly, not with fanfare, but steadily, thoughtfully, like a man who knew the mountain and wasn't afraid of the climb. Springfield, Illinois, by the early 1840s had become more than just a town for Abraham Lincoln. It was a stage, and not the grand kind, draped in velvet curtains, but a modest one made of courthouse steps, tavern benches, and church pews, where eyes watched and ears listened a little too closely. It was here that he met her, Mary Todd. She had arrived from Lexington, Kentucky, a world entirely different from Lincoln's. Where he had grown up among rail fences and frost-bitten mornings, Mary came from polished silver and formal dances. She was educated, witty, politically sharp. She read Shakespeare, spoke French, and could dismantle an opponent's argument with a flick of the fan and a half-smile. They met at a gathering hosted by her sister. Lincoln stood awkwardly in the corner, likely reciting jokes in his head to calm his nerves. Mary, ever curious, was drawn to his quiet confidence, that strange blend of humility and ambition that clung to him like dust from the prairie roads. They danced, they argued, they parted, they danced again. Their courtship was anything but smooth. But Springfield had a way of pulling people back together. Eventually, on a rainy day in November 1842, they married in her sister's parlour. Lincoln borrowed a suit. Mary wore a simple white dress. The ceremony was short, honest, full of hope and hesitation. From that moment forward, the two would be bound by love, arguments, laughter, and grief. Mary believed fiercely in Abraham. She saw in him what others didn't, something noble and unfinished. She pushed him, encouraged his political ambitions, reminded him that his words could move more than juries, they could move hearts. And Lincoln, he loved her, deeply, though sometimes with confusion. He once said, "My wife is as handsome as when she was a girl, and I fell in love with her, and I have been in an avalanche ever since." They moved into a modest house on 8th and Jackson Street, just south of the Capitol building. The home still stands today, a quiet place, shaded by trees that whisper old stories. Inside that house, laughter echoed, arguments too. Their 4 sons were born here, Robert, Edward, William, and Thomas. The home filled with toys, books, candle smoke, and muddy boots. And yet, life never slowed. Lincoln continued to practice law, traveling the Illinois circuit for weeks at a time. He'd ride on horseback or by wagon, staying at inns, sharing meals with judges and fellow lawyers. He was paid in everything from coins to potatoes. He carried all his case notes in a worn carpet bag. His absence was hard on Mary. She was raising children mostly alone, managing the household, fending off gossip and battling storms in her own mind. Her moods were known to swing like weather vanes, sudden and strong, but they stayed together. Love, for them, was never tidy. It was more like a tug of war across seasons. He wrote her often from the road. His letters were plain but warm. He never called her darling or dear heart, but he asked about the children, the neighbours, the garden. And when he returned, he brought stories, gifts, and time. One soft story survives from this period. Lincoln, returning after weeks away, found his youngest son, Tad, asleep on the floor, curled next to his boots. Instead of waking him, he lay down beside him and dozed off, muddy coat and all. He was never a man of pomp, but his love was steady. He read aloud to his children in the evenings, Shakespeare, Aesop, the Bible. He gave voices to each character, making his sons laugh until they hiccuped. He taught them to be kind, to ask questions, to tell the truth, even when it hurt. And at night, when the house was finally still, Abraham would sit by the fire, lean back in his wooden chair, and stare at the flames, thinking, always thinking. Politics was calling louder now. He had served a single term in Congress, but returned home disillusioned. He hated the infighting, the posturing, but Mary urged him on. "You were meant for more," she'd say, smoothing the wrinkles in his coat. He began to speak again, at public gatherings, in town halls, on makeshift stages in muddy fields, and people came, because something had changed. His voice had matured. It was still quiet, but it carried, like the wind across a plain. He spoke not just to win arguments, but to remind people of who they were, what they could be. One local editor wrote, "When Lincoln speaks, you feel like the truth itself walked into the room." And yet, even as his reputation grew, he remained grounded. He still chopped his own wood, still fetched water when the well ran dry, still kissed his children goodnight and made up stories about cats that ran for mayor. By the mid-1850s, Abraham Lincoln was no longer just the tall man from Springfield. He was becoming a voice that lingered after the applause had faded. The country was beginning to fracture, not loudly at first, but like a beam beneath too much weight. Whispers of disunion, shouts about slavery, states drawing invisible lines in the dust. And Lincoln listened. He had taken a break from politics after his one term in Congress, returning to law, to family, to long walks and quiet evenings. But something was stirring in the nation, and within him. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 was the spark. It allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery, essentially unraveling earlier compromises. Lincoln, always careful with words, found his temper rising. "This," he said, "is a vast moral evil." He began to speak again, not as a candidate, but as a citizen who could no longer stay silent. His speeches were different now, sharper, measured, not angry, but burning. He wasn't a natural firebrand. He didn't pound podiums or scream slogans. Instead, he asked questions, built arguments like houses, brick by brick, then stepped back and let the crowd walk through. He stood before assemblies in Springfield, Chicago, Peoria, speaking for hours without notes, describing not only the danger of slavery, but the danger of apathy. And always, somewhere near the end, he left a small space for conscience to enter. One night in 1854, he delivered a speech in Peoria so powerful that even those who disagreed with him stood in silence. He spoke for 3 hours, pausing only for breath and the occasional sip of water. A local newspaper editor wrote, "He did not shout, nor did he waver. He simply laid the truth in front of us and let it sit like a stone." And yet, not everyone admired him. He had no pedigree, no plantation, no polished accent, just a prairie drawl, a battered stovepipe hat, and ideas that made some deeply uncomfortable. Still, something shifted. He was invited to debate the most prominent Democrat in Illinois, Stephen A. Douglas. 7 times they faced each other across rough stages, fairgrounds and village greens in what became known as the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858. Douglas was shorter, fiery, and theatrical. Lincoln stood calm, with long arms folded like a patient schoolteacher. They sparred over slavery, the Constitution, states' rights. And while Douglas often won on bravado, Lincoln won something deeper. He won memory. People left those debates with his words echoing in their sleep. "A house divided against itself," he said, "cannot stand." Not a new phrase, but one he chose with care. He knew the risk. Many told him it was too blunt, too provocative. But Lincoln, always sensitive to the weight of silence, had begun to trust his own voice more than the advice of others. He didn't win that Senate race. Douglas kept the seat, but Lincoln's speeches were printed and reprinted across the North. The country began to lean in, just slightly, to the man who had spoken calmly through the rising storm. And here's a quiet curiosity. During these years, Lincoln carried with him not just notes and legal briefs, but clippings of poetry. He was especially fond of a melancholy Scottish poem titled Mortality, which mused on death, time, and the soul's mystery. Sometimes, before writing a speech, he would read it aloud to himself. Historians still wonder what these poems meant to him. Was it comfort, reflection, a secret ritual before speaking? No one knows. But the image of him, tall, alone, whispering poetry into the lamplight, is haunting in its own way. Back home, Mary watched his growing fame with a mixture of pride and worry. She encouraged him, pressed him forward, polished his public image, but also feared what lay ahead. Politics was not safe ground, and Lincoln's views were sharpening against a blade no one could yet see. Still, she kept the house warm, helped prepare notes, managed visitors, listened to speeches with eyes wide and lips pressed. The children, too, were growing. Robert, the eldest, was now a serious young man. Tad and Willie, still boys, filled the halls with footsteps and questions. Lincoln adored them, found peace in their laughter, and a kind of unspoken strength in the sound of them breathing peacefully at night. But beneath it all, the country was changing. States whispered secession, tempers frayed. Even the air seemed tighter, and Lincoln, though still a private man, began to feel the weight of a larger calling. He once told a friend, "I must stand with those who stand right, even if I stand alone." It was not a boast, just a fact. He still returned to the courtroom, still walked the same muddy roads, still split wood when needed. But now, when he looked in the mirror, he no longer saw just a lawyer or a husband or a storyteller. He saw someone who might, just might, be needed. And the winds of history, soft but growing, began to gather at his back. The year was 1860, a year that shimmered on the edge of chaos. And in a modest two-story home on 8th and Jackson Street in Springfield, Abraham Lincoln stood at a small wooden writing desk. The sunlight filtered through gauzy curtains. A child's toy lay forgotten near the hearth, and on the desk, a letter. He was being asked, officially, to accept the Republican nomination for President of the United States. Lincoln, now 51, read the words slowly, then read them again. He didn't leap for joy, didn't punch the air or run through the streets. He simply folded the letter, placed it on the corner of the desk, and sat down in the nearest chair, silently. Mary, watching from the doorway, saw it happen. The moment something cracked open inside him, something that would never close again. It was an unlikely nomination. He had never governed a state, had only served one term in Congress. He had no military record, no Southern alliances, no elegant speaking style. But what he had was something far rarer. People believed he meant what he said. That year, at the Republican convention in Chicago, Lincoln wasn't the favorite. He was the dark horse, a phrase still used today for candidates who come from the shadows. His name was barely on the first few ballots, but support swelled, quietly, like a tide. By the third ballot, the floor erupted. He had won. Mary wept. Some neighbors cheered, others whispered behind closed shutters, because the nation was already tearing itself in two. 7 states had promised to secede if a Republican, any Republican, was elected. And here stood Lincoln, tall and solemn in his best black coat, reading congratulatory telegrams in one hand and threats in the other. He didn't gloat. Instead, he looked out the window, beyond the town, to the rail lines and empty fields, and said, "There's trouble coming." In November of 1860, he was elected, without a single electoral vote from the South. It was unprecedented, and it meant war was no longer a whisper, it was breathing down the nation's neck. Historians still argue whether Lincoln could have prevented it, softened it, delayed it. But those who knew him said he spent the days after the election walking more than usual. Long walks through alleys and pastures, tipping his hat to children, staring at the horizon with a face like stone. And yet, even in this heavy season, there were small quirks. He refused to hire bodyguards, even after threats began arriving daily. He insisted on answering his own front door. When reporters came, he'd greet them barefoot, then apologize for the untied laces. When one visitor exclaimed, "You don't look like a president," Lincoln grinned and replied, "I didn't know presidents had a particular look." Then came the journey to Washington. A train ride across multiple states, planned carefully but shadowed with danger. Crowds gathered at every stop. Some cheered, some cursed. Lincoln waved from the platform, gave short speeches, thanked people for their hopes, but always kept his eyes moving. In Baltimore, a plot to assassinate him was uncovered. He was quickly rushed through the city in disguise, wrapped in a shawl, hat pulled low, arriving in Washington before dawn. Some mocked him for it, called him cowardly, but the truth is, he had never feared for himself, only for the Union. On March 4th, 1861, he stood on the steps of the Capitol, unfinished at the time, and took the oath of office. The sky was grey, the crowd tense. He raised one hand, placed the other on a borrowed Bible, and spoke. He didn't roar, didn't stir the crowd into frenzy. He simply spoke with stillness. We are not enemies, but friends. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. And yet, even as the final word left his lips, the first seeds of civil war were already rooted. In April, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter. The war had begun. Lincoln's face aged 10 years in one. His hair grayed, his shoulders sank. His voice, once full of warmth, now carried the dust of telegrams and battlefields. But he did not falter. He spent late nights in his study, reading military reports, drafting orders, answering letters from mothers who had lost sons. He walked among the soldiers, visited the wounded, listened more than he spoke. One soldier later wrote, "He looked at me not like a general, but like a father." And so, the man once called too strange, too poor, too awkward, now stood in the center of a fractured nation, hands outstretched, trying to hold the broken pieces in place. He didn't always succeed, but he never stopped trying. That, more than anything, made him unforgettable. It is said that during the war, Abraham Lincoln slept little. Washington, D.C., under his presidency, was not a place of rest, but of flickering gas lamps, echoing hoofbeats, and midnight telegrams that arrived like thunderclaps in quiet rooms. The White House, then far more modest than today, became part home, part command center. Soldiers camped in nearby parks. Cannons rolled through the avenues. The air hung with the scent of ink, damp wool, and smoke from chimneys that never quite stopped burning. Inside, Lincoln paced. He read reports from the front, carefully, slowly, sometimes twice. Every casualty weighed on him, not as numbers, but as names. He carried those names with him, in pockets, in silence. The Civil War was not one war, but thousands, each battle bleeding into the next. And yet, Lincoln chose not to command armies from afar like a distant emperor. He read every dispatch, personally wrote countless letters, walked to the War Department daily, sometimes 5 or 6 times a day, to receive updates. When generals hesitated, he waited. When they blundered, he forgave. And when they showed courage, he wept. One of the most overlooked moments in these years came not on a battlefield, but in a quiet hospital. Late one evening, Lincoln visited wounded soldiers, alone, slipping away from his aides. He walked among the rows of cots, stopping to speak with each man. To one, he adjusted a blanket. To another, he gently touched his shoulder and asked about home. One soldier, barely older than Tad, grabbed his hand and whispered, "I ain't got no mama anymore, sir." Lincoln knelt beside him and stayed until the boy fell asleep. He didn't write about it, didn't tell anyone. But stories like these filtered out through nurses and soldiers and became part of the legend forming around him, even as the war dragged on. Yet not all saw him kindly. He was mocked in the press, called a tyrant by some, a fool by others. Cartoons exaggerated his features, his lanky frame, his deep-set eyes, his unruly hair. But he didn't respond. He often joked about it instead. "Better to be silent and thought a fool," he once said, "than to speak and remove all doubt." He clung to humor like a lantern in a cave, and when the weight of the presidency grew too heavy, he told stories. Funny ones, bizarre ones, tales of frontier life, courtroom mishaps, even chickens getting stuck in fence posts. Cabinet members would groan, Mary would scold, but Lincoln would smile. Just slightly, because he knew what too much seriousness could do to a man's spirit. Behind his eyes, though, something deeper always lingered. Each decision meant lives, and the decisions were endless. Should slaves be allowed to join the Union Army? Should generals be fired for retreating? Should prisoners be exchanged? Should the Emancipation Proclamation be issued now or wait? He debated these questions not with thunder, but with thought, with long walks in the garden, with letters written late at night, with conversations that began with sighs and ended in silence. It's a little-known fact that Lincoln had dreams, vivid, often symbolic. In one, he dreamt of drifting alone across a vast sea in a strange ship, its sails white as snow. He shared the dream with his cabinet before major decisions. Some say he believed they meant something. Others say he was simply trying to understand the immensity of what surrounded him. Historians still debate how deeply spiritual he truly was. He rarely mentioned church, never joined one, but his speeches and letters grew increasingly rich with biblical cadence, echoes of justice, mercy, and sorrow stitched into every phrase. He carried a worn Bible with him everywhere. Sometimes he read it aloud to himself before sunrise. One night, as the war stretched into its third year, he was overheard whispering these words from Psalms. "The Lord is my refuge and my strength, a very present help in trouble." And yet, even as he sought refuge, his own house was unraveling. Mary, devastated by the loss of their son Edward years earlier, began to withdraw from society. And when their third son, Willie, bright, beloved, full of song, died in 1862 of typhoid fever, she collapsed into grief. She wore black for months, would not leave her room, refused to let anyone touch Willie's things. And Lincoln, burdened with the war, now carried the weight of a grieving wife and two confused children, Tad and Robert, who looked to him for comfort even as his own heart bled quietly. He never wept in public, but those close to him said his eyes often glistened without ever spilling over. Once, after a long meeting, he opened a drawer in his desk, took out one of Willie's drawings, and held it for several minutes without a word, then folded it gently and put it away. This, too, was war, the kind that cracks inside the soul. Still, he kept going. The room was quiet. It was January 1st, 1863, and Abraham Lincoln sat alone for a moment in his study, the Emancipation Proclamation resting before him like a stone waiting to be lifted. His right hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion. He had shaken hundreds of hands earlier that day at the New Year's reception. The tendons in his fingers were tight and sore. He worried that if he signed now, the quiver in his hand would make the signature look hesitant, and so he waited. Then, with calm breath and steady resolve, he dipped the pen, bent over the paper, and wrote, "By the President of the United States of America, a proclamation." And with that stroke, more than 3 million enslaved men, women, and children in Confederate-held territory were declared free. It was a moment that had been years in the making, and yet the proclamation was not perfect. It did not end slavery across the entire nation. It applied only to those in rebellion, not the border states. It was a wartime measure, more symbolic than enforceable in many areas. But it mattered. It mattered deeply, because symbols can move hearts, and words, once written, can move armies. Historians still argue whether Lincoln's moral stance had evolved gradually, or whether he had always believed in emancipation but bided his time. The truth likely lives somewhere in between. What's certain is this: by signing the document, he changed the very meaning of the war. It was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was now about human dignity, freedom, a nation reborn, and it came at a cost. Lincoln knew the political gamble he had taken. Northern Democrats raged. Even some Union soldiers wrote home, unsure whether they still supported the cause. But others, especially among the enslaved, began to dream in color again. That spring, Frederick Douglass visited the White House. The two men sat across from one another, each changed by the years, each carrying different wounds, but meeting as equals. They spoke of war, justice, and the long road still ahead. Douglass later wrote that Lincoln was the first great man I ever talked with in the United States freely, without embarrassment. Lincoln invited him back again. There are whispers that they spoke more than history remembers. That Douglass offered him more than advice, he offered clarity. In the months that followed, African Americans were officially allowed to enlist in the Union Army. By war's end, nearly 200,000 black soldiers had served, and though they were often given the worst equipment, the lowest pay, and the most dangerous assignments, they fought with a purpose few others could understand. One such unit, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, would later be immortalized in film and song. But to Lincoln, every soldier mattered equally. He once stood on a small hill overlooking a training ground, watching a group of black recruits drilling in the morning sun. "They have truly taken up the cause of their own liberty," he murmured to a friend beside him. "That is sacred." Meanwhile, the war churned on. The year 1863 brought both triumph and torment. Gettysburg, Vicksburg, thousands more lives swallowed by the soil. But Lincoln never stopped speaking, never stopped writing. One of his most moving letters came in November of that year, after a mother named Lydia Bixby lost 5 sons in the war. Lincoln's letter to her is short, only a few paragraphs, but it has become one of the most profound notes of sorrow ever penned. He wrote of the solemn pride that must be yours to have laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom. And then, quietly, he signed it, A. Lincoln. There's some debate among historians whether he actually wrote the letter or if it came from his secretary, but either way, it bore his name and his spirit, and that was enough. During these years, people often lined up outside the White House just to catch a glimpse of him. He would step out, tip his hat, offer a joke, ask about someone's children, then disappear back inside to face another impossible day. One soldier later said, "When he looked at you, it was like he saw everything, and forgave it." He was weary now, taller than before somehow, thinner, his face carved by care, but his mind was clearer than ever. He began planning a second term, not for glory, but because he believed the work was not yet done. He knew the war would end, but peace, real peace, would require more than parades and papers. It would need healing, and he was already beginning to write those lines. Lines about mercy, lines about rebuilding, lines that would one day appear in the most poetic speech ever given by an American president. But that would come later. For now, he folded the Emancipation Proclamation once more, placed it in the drawer, and walked to the window. Outside, the trees were bare, but somewhere beneath the earth, something had already begun to bloom. The war outside may have begun to turn, but inside the walls of the White House, a quieter battle played out, one that wore no uniform, left no maps behind, and claimed no headlines. It was the battle of the Lincoln family. In February of 1862, the light in their home dimmed. It began with a fever. Their son, Willie, just 11 years old, had fallen ill. Typhoid, they said, carried by the tainted waters that flowed through the capital's open gutters. Washington was still part village, part battlefield, and its sanitation lagged behind its politics. Willie had always been Lincoln's favorite, bright, curious, tender-hearted. A child who, unlike his more mischievous brother Tad, seemed born with his father's inward soul. He loved poetry, played the piano, wrote little essays, and left them folded in corners of the house. In the weeks that followed, Abraham and Mary sat by his bed as the illness worsened. Mary wept openly. Lincoln, though quieter, was no less shattered. He stroked his son's damp forehead, held his hand, whispered things no one else ever heard. When Willie passed, the house fell into mourning. Mary collapsed into grief, draped mirrors, refused visitors, held seances with spiritualists, desperate for a sign from the other side. Lincoln retreated into silence. He walked alone for hours, sat beside the fireplace with Willie's books, turning the pages slowly, as if hoping to catch a fading scent or hear a laugh trapped between the margins. He once told a friend, "My poor boy, he was too good for this world." It wasn't just loss, it was guilt, the war, the White House, the politics. All of it seemed to steal from him the things he loved most. Tad, the youngest, tried to fill the silence with noise. He galloped through the halls on toy horses, hosted mock cabinet meetings with chairs and hats. He even once locked the Secretary of War out of his own office. Lincoln didn't scold him. He laughed, but it was a distant laugh, like wind brushing dry grass. At night, the president would sometimes slip away, not into meetings, but into the soldiers' home, a quiet cottage on the outskirts of the city where the breezes were cooler and the sky less burdened by noise. He would ride there alone, often without escort, thinking through speeches, walking the grounds beneath trees older than the Republic. There, among the crickets and twilight, he found a strange peace, but always he returned to Washington, to war rooms and telegrams, to sorrow and strategy. And as the nation reeled, he began preparing for what came next. Reconciliation. Lincoln knew the South could not simply be conquered, it had to be welcomed back. Even as battles raged, he spoke of binding up the nation's wounds and malice toward none. This confused many, even angered some. But Lincoln had seen enough grief to understand that punishment rarely heals. And so he waited. Waited for generals to bring news of turning tides. Waited for nights when Mary could sleep through till morning. Waited for his own heart to forgive itself. One peculiar story survives from this time. Late one night, he was found pacing the hallway, barefoot, holding a candle and reciting lines from Macbeth. "Tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow," he whispered. "Creeps in this petty pace from day to day." His servant asked if he was troubled. Lincoln paused, then said only, "Words help." It's moments like these that remind us the Civil War didn't just shape a country, it carved itself into the ribs of the man leading it. He was no emperor, no king, just a father, a husband, a man with too little sleep and too much sorrow. And still, he pressed on. Every morning he rose before dawn, wrote letters, answered the nation's ache. He read newspapers filled with bitter criticism, laughed at some, folded others neatly and tucked them away. Once, when accused of being too slow, he said, "I am the tallest man I know, and tall men walk carefully." Yet for all his heaviness, he still made time for small things. He pardoned soldiers accused of desertion, especially young ones. He listened to widows tell their stories. He allowed his son Tad to burst into cabinet meetings, even mid-crisis. Tad once tried to convince the Secretary of the Treasury to print money with his father's face on it. Lincoln, overhearing, chuckled, "Let's win the war first, son." And then came 1864. The war was tipping in the Union's favor, but the country remained exhausted. So did Lincoln. The re-election campaign began, and many thought he would lose. Even some within his own party doubted him. But as ballots were cast that November, a strange thing happened. The people chose him again, not with shouts, but with trust. Because though he looked older, though his hands trembled and his eyes sagged, he had become something rare, a leader not of force, but of steadiness. And as he stood before the crowds again, preparing for another term, he reached not for victory, but for grace. March 4th, 1865. The sky hung low over Washington, thick with spring mist. Rain had passed through earlier in the morning, leaving puddles in the worn roads and a quiet sheen on the stones of the Capitol steps. Abraham Lincoln stood tall beneath the unfinished dome, his stovepipe hat removed, his face paler now, thinner, worn by years of wait. But in his posture, there was calm, not triumph, not relief, just calm. He had been re-elected in the middle of a civil war, and now, as the nation waited, soaked coats clinging to weary shoulders, Lincoln opened his mouth and began what would become one of the most hauntingly beautiful speeches in American history, the second inaugural address. He did not speak of victory. He did not mock the fallen South or praise the rising North. Instead, he gave the country a sermon. With malice toward none, with charity for all. The words drifted out, soft but sure, like the echo of a hymn. He acknowledged slavery, not with cruelty or blame, but with gravity. He spoke of shared guilt, of divine mystery, of wounds to bind, not to deepen. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle. Historians still marvel at this moment. How could a man so battered by war still summon compassion? How could a president speak of mercy when the fields were still warm with loss? Some say it was his melancholy, that deep river that ran through him, that helped him understand pain from all sides. Others say it was Mary, or the death of Willie, or the long hours spent alone in thought. But whatever the source, the words floated above the heads of the crowd, light as dandelion seeds, and settled in the hearts of a nation still unsure whether it could heal. After the speech, one senator whispered, "That was not a man, that was a prophet." But Lincoln, humble as ever, simply folded the paper and returned to his chair. There were more urgent things to do. General Grant was closing in on Richmond. Sherman had carved a path through Georgia. The Confederacy was crumbling, not loudly, but like a slow-motion collapse. One by one, the pieces were falling. And Lincoln? He spent his days less in celebration and more in planning. He spoke often of reconstruction, not as a policy, but as a moral responsibility. "The South is wounded," he said once in a cabinet meeting. "We must not press our heels into the wound." He wanted schools, roads, food for the poor, fair courts, and above all, forgiveness. It puzzled many, infuriated some, but Lincoln had no interest in punishment. "Do I not destroy my enemies," he said, "when I make them my friends?" He made visits to the army hospitals almost daily now. Once, while talking with a soldier who had lost both legs, Lincoln took off his own gloves and handed them to the young man. "You need them more than I do," he said with a soft nod. He also visited the telegraph office, his favorite place outside the White House. There, among the clicking keys and fresh ink, he found quiet focus. He wrote drafts, asked for updates, sometimes stood in silence for long minutes, eyes closed, listening to the rhythm of war as it transmitted in code. Here's a small curiosity. Lincoln was the first US president to use the telegraph extensively. He treated it almost like a diary, writing urgent thoughts, waiting for answers in dots and dashes. He had become a man of both parchment and pulse. And still, the war inched toward its end. One morning, while Mary was reading the paper aloud at breakfast, Lincoln interrupted her and said, "We are almost through with our sorrow." It was the first hopeful thing he'd said in weeks. And it would not be the last, because just days later, something extraordinary happened. He received word that Richmond, the Confederate capital, had fallen. The war's heart had stopped. Lincoln, unable to contain himself, decided to travel there. Against all warnings, without armor or grand parade, he rowed a steamboat down the James River and entered Richmond on foot, tall, unguarded, and recognizable. The city was in ruins, streets littered with ash, the air thick with the scent of burning cotton and broken dreams. And yet, people gathered. Newly freed men, women and children came running, calling out to him, reaching for his hands. One man fell to his knees before him. Lincoln, startled, gently placed his hand on the man's shoulder and said, "Don't kneel to me. That's not right. You must kneel only to God. You're free now." The words were quiet, but they shook the dust from history. No photograph captured that moment. No speech was made. But it lives on in memory, like a sunrise too beautiful to paint. Abraham Lincoln, once the barefoot boy from a Kentucky cabin, was now walking through the wreckage of war, not as a conqueror, but as a healer. And with each step, something softened, not just in the ground, but in the air. The war was ending. Like a storm that had raged for years, the thunder began to drift away, leaving behind silence, debris, and the aching hush of things that would never quite return to how they were. In early April 1865, the Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The terms were generous. There was no humiliation, no parading of prisoners. Grant allowed the Confederate soldiers to keep their horses and return home in peace. Lincoln had instructed him to be kind. "Let them up easy," he had said. And just like that, the bloodiest conflict in American history, one that had claimed over 600,000 lives, was over. But Lincoln knew peace was not the end. It was the beginning. He walked the White House halls slower now, not from weariness alone, but from reflection, from holding the weight of a nation on his shoulders for 4 long years, and knowing that now he would have to carry the fragile hope of rebuilding. He spoke often of what needed to come next, not punishment, but repair, not vengeance, but understanding. He imagined a future where the South would be welcomed back, not with iron shackles, but open arms. Some in his cabinet called this naive, others revolutionary, but Lincoln remained unmoved. "This is our chance," he said quietly, "to be better than what we were." He began outlining plans for reintegrating southern states, for supporting formerly enslaved families, for rebuilding schools and roads. He knew it would take decades. He didn't care. He was ready. And so, with spring budding gently in Washington, Abraham Lincoln allowed himself, for the first time in years, to feel joy. He spent more time with Mary and their youngest son, Tad. He rode horses again, told jokes over dinner, even attended the theatre, something he hadn't done in a very long time. In one of his last carriage rides with Mary, he spoke about the future. He talked about returning to Springfield. He missed the rhythm of small-town life, missed the dusty roads, the neighbors, the simplicity. He dreamed aloud of reopening his law practice, buying a small plot of land, and perhaps even traveling, maybe to California. Mary later said he seemed lighter that day, as if something had finally been released. There's a strange little anecdote from that same week. A young boy stopped Lincoln outside the White House gates and asked, wide-eyed, "Are you really the president?" Lincoln knelt down, smiled, and said, "Some days I wonder that myself." Then ruffled the boy's hair, tipped his hat, and walked on. Another moment. A soldier, seeing Lincoln approach on horseback, saluted clumsily and shouted, "God bless you, Mr. President." Lincoln slowed the horse, turned, and replied with quiet sincerity, "And may he bless you, my boy, for giving us back our peace." That was the thing. Even in his moments of triumph, Lincoln remained humble. He never spoke like a man who believed he'd won. He spoke like a man who'd simply endured. But something inside him, something gentle, perhaps childlike, was returning. In the final cabinet meeting he ever attended, he spoke of the South, of reconciliation, of dreams. His secretaries noted he looked radiant, as if a long winter had finally ended inside him. Historians still study those last days. The tone of his letters, the brightness in his eyes. There's debate about whether he sensed what was coming. He told several people he had had strange dreams. One in particular stayed with him. He dreamed he was walking through the White House and heard sobbing. Room after room, he searched for the source. Finally, in the East Room, he found a coffin. Guards stood by. "Who is dead in the White House?" he asked. "A president," one replied. "He was killed by an assassin." He told the dream to his wife. She begged him not to return to the theatre that week, but he did, because Lincoln believed always that fear should not keep a man from living his duty. And so, just days after the surrender at Appomattox, he walked with Mary to Ford's Theatre to see a comedy called Our American Cousin. He laughed that night, held Mary's hand, spoke kindly to those around him. The play had just begun its second act when history, quiet and cruel, moved again. But this story we're telling tonight, it does not end with that moment, because Lincoln's final chapter is not written in the gunshot or the chaos that followed, but in what he left behind. His words, his example, his stillness in the storm. He had arrived as a boy with a book and a heart full of questions. He had left as the soul of a nation. And while his body may have returned to the soil of Springfield, wrapped in black cloth and pulled gently by a mourning train through towns and fields where children wept and bells tolled, his spirit stayed. In courthouses and classrooms, in quiet libraries, in the long shadows of oak trees, in every person who chooses courage over cruelty and kindness over power. The train that carried Abraham Lincoln home moved slowly, too slowly for most schedules, but just right for sorrow. It departed Washington in late April 1865, its black-draped engine humming like a mourner's sigh. All along the tracks, from Baltimore to New York, through Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and finally to Illinois, people stood in silence. Tens of thousands, farmers with hats held to their hearts, children on their fathers' shoulders, black families kneeling by fences, their hands folded in prayer, Union soldiers, heads bowed, medals catching the last light of day. The train didn't rush. It glided through the heart of a country that was finally at peace, but unsure how to breathe again. In each city, Lincoln's coffin was placed in a public hall or rotunda, surrounded by flowers, flags, and candles that flickered all night. People waited in line for hours to pass by. Some wept quietly. Others simply stood and looked. It wasn't just a body they mourned. It was the soul of something, gentle, steady, unshakably kind. At last, the train reached Springfield. The town was quiet. No speeches, no parades, just bells tolling, birds pausing mid-song, and a breeze that rustled the grass around his old home on 8th Street, the same house where he'd once read to his children, where he'd kissed Mary on the cheek before heading to debate Douglas, where he'd promised a nation he would try. He was buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery, beneath a gentle hill surrounded by trees. But this is not where our story truly ends, because the end of Lincoln's life was not the end of his journey. His ideas lived on, his humility became legend, his words, spare, beautiful, carved with care, were carried in the pockets of immigrants, scribbled on chalkboards, stitched into the memory of a nation that, for all its faults, had learned to hope again. Schools would be named for him. Statues would rise. A memorial, shaped like a Greek temple, would hold his gaze over a reflecting pool where children now feed ducks and ask questions about the man in the big chair. But perhaps more powerful than any monument is this. Lincoln taught us that a soft voice can carry farther than a shout. That strength lies not in fists, but in forgiveness. That leadership is not about being the loudest, but about listening first. Historians still debate the reach of his legacy. They ask if Reconstruction could have gone differently had he lived. They wonder what more he might have achieved, how he would have handled the tremors to come, the cracks in the new peace. But most agree on this. He left America better than he found it. Not perfect, but possible. He remains, like the lanterns that once lined the halls of the White House, flickering with meaning, casting shadows that stretch into our own time. And maybe in the end, that's enough. Because for all his titles, for all the weight he carried, Abraham Lincoln never tried to be remembered as a hero. He only tried to do what was right. He once said, "I am nothing but truth is everything." And in a world of noise, it is his stillness we remember. His patience, his deep, hard-earned hope, the boy who read by firelight, the man who spoke at Gettysburg, the father who carried sorrow without breaking, the leader who chose unity over pride. He never finished his work. But perhaps we were never meant to finish it alone. We carry it now, and we walk, step by thoughtful step, along the path he cleared. A path through forests, through grief, through questions with no easy answers, but always, always towards something better. And now, let us breathe. The story of Abraham Lincoln lingers like twilight across the fields of time. It's not loud anymore. It drifts, like wood smoke, like the scent of old pages, like the sound of your own heartbeat when everything else is still. You can almost hear the creak of a rocking chair in Springfield, the distant tick of a clock in the corner of his study, a child's laughter fading down the hall. These sounds are not gone, just softened, because history never truly leaves us. It settles into the quiet places, waiting to be felt, not just told. Lincoln's life was not perfect. It was full of waiting, wondering, trying, failing, and trying again. But he showed us that even in the midst of storms, political or personal, we can choose kindness. We can choose to listen. We can choose to begin again. So now, as your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts begin to drift, carry this story with you. Let it settle like a warm blanket over your shoulders. Let it remind you that greatness often begins with small, quiet things. A borrowed book, a heartfelt letter, a whispered truth, a steady heart. And as night wraps itself around you, know that somewhere in time, the boy with the long legs and solemn eyes is still reading by firelight, still dreaming, still walking beside you.